Thank you, Mr. Teuermann. And now Madame Mélanie de Groof, researcher in the Arms Transfers and Small Arms Project.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. I am a jurist specialized in international law and more specifically in human rights law and humanitarian law. This is why during the next 12 minutes, so it will be a bit longer than my predecessors, I will focus my attention, and hopefully yours, on the human rights criteria and the humanitarian law criteria as well, which EU member states must take into account when they decide whether or not to grant export licenses. Especially today, doing research on the topic of arms transfers in view of human rights and humanitarian law standards is an extremely interesting and important activity. This is so because over the last decade, EU arms have been used for committing human rights abuses or internal repression on several occasions. To illustrate, in the year 2008, the Belgian army supplied Bahrain with 50 armored combat vehicles. In the context of the so-called Arab Spring, these vehicles have reportedly been used against peaceful protesters. This example discloses the risks of supplying authoritarian regimes with arms and military equipment. Another example, in Libya, EU member states sold massive amounts of arms to a repressive regime and to an irrational dictator. I have an anecdote on this. Years ago, Gaddafi identified about 20 traditional kings in Africa. He united them in Libya and he made them nominate him as the King of the Kings. In spite of this megalomania and repressive internal policy in Libya, EU member states have continued to send arms to Libya, and today Libya is the quintessential example of an accumulation of arms, the amount being disproportionate to the size of the Libyan territory and the needs of the Libyan population. It is certainly so that lessons from supplying unstable regimes with arms have still not been learned. In the UK, for example, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office made a list of, and I open quotation, countries of human rights concern. Nevertheless, the UK government has authorized exports to several of these countries. According to the NGO Safer World, while not all of these licenses are problematic, many of them, for example those to Libya, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Sri Lanka, are a real cause of concern in light of human rights standards. A second reason why the topic of human rights criteria in arms export is so important and challenging is because there are several identified cases of massive arms transfers to states which take a lead in arming groups that violate international law on a systematic basis. The most obvious illustrations are the EU arms transfers to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, such as Qatar. Both states are actively arming the armed opposition groups involved in the Syrian conflict. And while initially it was especially the Assad regime that was accused of mass atrocities, today there is conclusive evidence that the numerous anti-government armed groups are guilty of gross human rights violations and war crimes as well. Saudi Arabia is the biggest recipient state of EU arms. For the year 2012, Saudi Arabia represents almost 9% of the authorized EU export licenses. Saudi Arabia is one of the principal providers of arms to the Syrian opposition, which is very divided today, with a sharp increase in weapon supplies in the year 2013. While exporting states have of course argued that the clauses prohibiting re-exports in the arms contracts are a guarantee for EU arms not being brought into the Syrian territory, it is clear that Gulf states can only supply their old stocks to the Syrian rebels if new weapons come in. And EU members must be well aware of that. As a human rights lawyer, let me now briefly explain why such arms transfers to states which are either directly or indirectly involved in gross human rights violations are problematic under international law and may bring about international responsibility of EU member states. The permissibility of arms transfers is conditioned by EU law, but also by international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international law governing the use of force. Within the EU context, and I start with that, several documents must be taken into account when a state considers exporting arms to third states. From a human rights and humanitarian law perspective, the 2008 Common Position, which was discussed earlier already, on exports of military technology and equipment is of a significant value. This legally binding document compels EU member states to assess the export license applications against 8 criteria. Careful reading of the Common Position allows for the conclusion that an EU member state is compelled not to export or to deny export licenses for military technology and equipment to a state, 1, if this would be inconsistent with its international obligations. 2, if there is a clear risk that this military technology and equipment might be used for internal repression. 3, if there is a clear risk that this military technology and equipment might be used for serious violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. 4, if this would provoke or prolong armed conflict. And 5, if there is a clear risk that this would endanger regional peace, security, and stability. Certainly, it is often argued that the language of the 2008 Common Position is not very precise and that it offers a large margin of interpretation and a large margin of appreciation. Yet, the correct application of the rules of interpretation of the European Court of Justice allows for the conclusion that it is simply prohibited to export arms if such transfers would activate these 5 risks articulated earlier, which the EU precisely wanted to avoid. Second, in addition to EU law, the legality of arms transfers is also conditioned by international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international law governing the use of force. As this session focuses on the rights of the individual human being, I will not further elaborate on the principles regulating the use of force in international relations. I will just briefly explain the basic principles of the law on human rights and humanitarian law. And I think it will take about 5 minutes now. If we first look at a state's obligations under international humanitarian law, we must distinguish between the obligation to respect and the obligation to ensure respect for the law governing armed conflicts. In the first place, international humanitarian law articulates obligations for the parties to a conflict. Thus, when a state becomes directly involved in an armed conflict, such as the one in Syria, for example, it is by definition bound to respect applicable rules of international humanitarian law. However, and this is important for EU member states as well, international humanitarian law also creates obligations for states which are not a party sensu stricto to the armed conflict. This obligation of non-state parties to the conflict is clearly articulated in Article 1, common to all 4 Geneva Conventions, which provides, and I quote, "The high contracting parties undertake to respect and to ensure respect for the present convention in all circumstances." The words ensure respect mean that a state must abstain from aiding and assisting in the commission of violations of international humanitarian law. This means that when a state considers to provide, either directly or indirectly, as is the case in Syria, military support to parties to an armed conflict, a state must make sure that these arms are not used for the commission of violations of the law of armed conflict, such as indiscriminate killing of civilians, extrajudicial killings, acts of torture, and so on. Thus, EU member states, whenever they are aware that there is a risk that their arms transfers to countries such as Saudi Arabia may facilitate the commission of crimes in a country such as Syria, they are obliged to abstain from such transfers. Very briefly, similarly, most important human rights treaties oblige states to both respect and ensure respect of human rights. Even though the extraterritorial application of human rights is a constantly evolving concept, it seems right to argue that it is prohibited for states to transfer arms if there is a clear risk that they may be used for the perpetration of gross human rights violations abroad. Last, and I will stop my legal analysis with this legal instrument, Article 16 of the International Law Commission's articles on state responsibility provides that a state which aids or assists another state in the commission of an internationally wrongful act can be internationally responsible for doing so. Under certain circumstances, EU member states can thus be held accountable if their arms are used for the commission of international crimes abroad. The doctrine of responsibility to protect supports this finding. The conclusion is that under European and international law, it is prohibited for EU member states to facilitate, contribute to, or support abuses abroad, for example, through the transfer of arms. EU member states can just not turn a blind eye on the risks of their arms transfers. EU member states must apply a tighter human rights policy when issuing licenses. And in accordance with the proposal of Safer World, I would argue that EU governments should be more transparent when permitting arms exports to countries that pose real human rights concern, such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Libya, Sri Lanka, Egypt, and so on. Governments should, amongst others, inform their respective parliaments on the precise end users, on what the goods are supposed to be used for, and on why the government is so confident that it is safe to export. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madame de Groof. And now the floor is open to members.